It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Trainin. Dr. Trainin is an associate professor of education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and our visionary keynote speaker for TechEdge 9. Dr. Trainin is a creative researcher and teacher interested in reading acquisition, motivation, reading fluency, and educational technology. As the primary investigator of technology education in digital and global environments, our TechEdge, he's planned 9 conferences on technology integration, impacting hundreds of elementary teachers, pre-service teachers, and university instructors, as well as creating over 100 webcasts for iPads in the classroom, which are located at our TechEdge 01 YouTube channel. Dr. Trainin's vita is impressive. He was the 2012 Swanson Teacher of the Year. He's had many publications in the form of books, refereed articles, and digital publications. He's presented internationally, nationally, at the state and local level with research, and he has worked with over $11 million in funded grants, including innovation projects supporting iPad rollout in elementary schools and developing media capacity. As 21st century skills became an emphasis and multiple literacy standards were introduced, Dr. Trainin became an expert in new literacies himself and began to present them in his courses and in professional development activities. His desire is to always be ahead of the curve professionally. Himself, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the schools with whom we partner, and our graduates. Dr. Trainin has been instrumental in bringing current educational technology into the elementary education program at UNL. His year-long funded study of iPads in the Literacy Methods block, clinical practicum at the Schmoker Reading Center, and Math Methods block have led to a new tablet requirement for elementary education students that began this fall. He believes in preparing teachers to be leaders in teaching in the 21st century classroom. When empty iPads were handed out to undergraduate and graduates in courses, Dr. Trainin taught the basics and then challenged students to explore apps for teaching and learning. Whenever there were questions, he was there to guide, and much learning happened as one student helped another, making them the teachers of this new technology rather than the learners only. This format is now used at TechEdge as teachers learn how to use mobile devices and other technologies to extend learning within the curriculum. So this morning, Dr. Trainin will share with us his latest insights as he challenges us with his keynote presentation, From Ancient Scrolls to Digital Media, Educating in the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Trainin.
So, I don't know if you know this place, but this is far away. This is right next to the Dead Sea, and in about 1946, a few Bedouins walking around the desert, looking for something to sell, really, when you really think about it, found some scrolls and they decided to bring them to market, and they brought them to market. They sold them for something like $27, give or take. And it turned out that the people who eventually bought them were archaeologists that realized that these scrolls are about 2,000 years old. And that potentially there's a lot more there. Now, there's a reason it happens there, not anywhere else in the world, because the Dead Sea, most of you haven't been there or recommend going, but the Dead Sea is an extremely dry and secluded place. And as a result, these things, these scrolls that would have been destroyed in any other environment survived for 2,000 years in caves right there. Eventually, hundreds of scrolls were found there in the Qumran areas in the 1940s and the 1950s, and they have been studied from that moment until today. And we really have learned a lot from them. But what's interesting about them is that for about the first 50 years, we've had only a few select people who were ever able to actually study. So some of them were presented in Israel and around the world. There was a show that toured the United States and Canada, for example. But researchers and lay people could come and take a glimpse of them, but not do anything else. And the reason I'm talking about this will become clear later. And if we scroll forward, if you will, a few thousand years, in 2010, the iPad was introduced. And I have to admit that for the 15 years before the iPad was introduced, I was looking for the iPad. So I went and talked to anybody who was interested in technology and wanted to know if there is a large screen touch technology that would do all these wonderful things that I could imagine I would do with it. So when this was presented, and I do remember when it was presented, it was received with a lot of skepticism. It was received with skepticism because everybody already had an iPhone or an iPod Touch and other touch devices. I had them too. And everybody said, that's too big, that's too, what is this thing? It's not a computer, it's not a phone, it's something in between. Do we really need this thing? I knew one thing, I needed that thing. And apparently I wasn't the only one because there were long lines of people trying to get that thing. So whether we really needed it, we thought we did, or at least we thought we wanted it. And so this has started. And this is important, I think, because this really, and people say this and ask, so one of the things that I hear, and I hear very often, is what is new about all of this? I just read, I think this weekend, an article that said, what are you going to get if you're going to use tablet? Maybe 5% increase in achievement. And by the way, 5% increase in achievement for anybody who's ever tried that, that's not easy. That's probably worth doing, but I don't think that's where it's at. I do not think that this device or other device like it, and I talk about the iPad because frankly, it is my favorite device. But there are other ones. And the idea of the tablet, something with a very large screen that you can use, that you can take around with you, that you can read from, more like a book, the comfort of a book. I mean, I love computers. I have my own laptop. I use it a lot, but it is not the same thing. I do not go to bed lying on my side with my computer tilted like this, hoping that I can decipher what it says. I never have. But I do that with my iPad, sometimes with my phone. So when people say nothing new under the sun, they mean at the heart of education, with technological innovation, education stays education. Reading stays reading, math stays math, right? Social studies stay social studies, etc., etc. Unfortunately for all of you, I don't believe so, or we could be done right now and we could be moving on. And the other piece here is that I often think in historical ways. Originally, my undergraduate is in history and Middle Eastern studies. So when I think about this in long historical terms, and I want to start with the first thing, and that is the invention of writing. Why the invention of writing? Because about 5,500 years ago, writing started in Sumer, in Mesopotamia. And it's not the only place. Actually, writing developed around the world in a few places, more or less independently, and with very, very similar patterns. People started drawing on things that could keep. In the case of Sumer, it was really on wet clay tablets that could be dried up and preserved, and then you can pass them on to whoever needed. Usually it started with commerce and then with government, and so the IRS goes back all the way to the dawn of time. But the point is not that we started. The point was that from the moment we started, the technology we used actually determined how we taught and how we wrote, and how we thought. So for example, if you look at the original writing, it started as pictures. People communicated with pictures. They drew little pictures of wheat and little pictures of ox and whatever else they needed to do. And sometimes they had number symbols because you had to count them, and it got to be tiresome after a while, drawing every little stalk of wheat. So you had to come with a better system. That's fantastic. But very quickly, it became obvious to them that you can't really communicate well if you don't have a set of symbols that you can use, because if you draw it that way, if you've ever seen me draw, you know the problem right there, right? If I can't read your drawing, that's not helping me. So you've got to develop something that is more or less custom and used by everybody. That's fantastic. That's first step. The second step was technological, and that was it's really hard to draw complicated shapes on clay. I invite everybody to try. It's really, really hard to make circles and winding lines to describe all the things you do. So very quickly, and you can see that up there, they had to start going to straight lines, and those lines are not defined, oh, we need symbols. It's defined by, this is the easiest thing we can do. So technology, this earth, 5,500 years ago, give or take a couple of days, they have already used technology. And technology really dictated, in many ways, what form it took. So technology does matter, and I think you all agree that technology does matter, but technology changes things in meaningful ways. And one of those ways is that right after writing shows up, do you know what shows up? Schools show up. This is an early school from about the same time. This is just over 5,000 years old. And you can recognize the rows, right? Where the students sat. And they had these tablets, and if you see those basins in the back, those basins in the back are where you have a little more clay so you can put it over and try it over again. This is fantastic. They're reusing the same materials, right? They're environmentally conscious. But until we invented writing, until we did all of that, there was no point. There was no point in schools, because what would you teach? If you need to teach somebody how to plow, you send them to the field to plow. But if you have a system of writing with accepted symbols, now you have to send somebody to school to learn those accepted symbols. Now, not everybody went to school. And that took a long time till we sent everybody to school, because we needed a few more innovations on the way till we sent everybody to school. Does anybody know what this is? This is a page out of a Gutenberg Bible. And it's illustrated around the size, and the reason it's illustrated is that it's an accepted norm of the time. That is, before we started the printing press, we had monks sitting in monasteries, copying very carefully, drawing on the sides, and illustrating wonderful illustrations. We didn't need a lot of people writing at the time. The Chinese did at the time, but we didn't. We didn't have very sophisticated forms of government. We didn't need too many records. We had a few people that could read and write, but really the bottleneck was technology. We didn't have a technology that could allow us to read and write like we do today. We couldn't give a book to every person. We couldn't give a device to every person. These were preserved books. They sat in very safe places. We hoped they would not burn down, and when they did, it was a disaster. Because potentially you lost those sources of information forever. And this is not that long ago. And so once again, technology changes everything. And once we have a printing press, suddenly education changes as well. So education really ramps up and follows innovation in many, many ways. When innovation comes in, whether education likes it or not, whether we like it or not, and always, 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 there's a war about that. Somebody is extremely unhappy that we're changing the way things used to be. And there will always be people that would be upset and would see value in things that actually stem from it will see value in things that stem from really technological constraints. That is, the reason that very few people dedicated their whole lives to doing this task was we didn't have any better way to do it. It's not because it was that great. And any of you that thinks it's that great, I recommend trying to sit and copy books for a few hours every day with those limited implements. This is a American spelling book. This is what you can do when you can print. You can suddenly have a spelling book. And two things happen here. One is you have to have a spelling book because now you have a lot more people writing. Why? Because you can publish more. You have a lot more people reading because you can put a book in every school, in every home, at least a few. Not necessarily hundreds, but definitely 5. You need a prayer book, right? You need a Bible, and you definitely need a spelling book, right? This is Noah Webster's spelling book. But if you remember, and I don't know if you do or not, but really there was no point to teaching spelling to anybody before we did this, because there were two kinds of scholarships. One was you copied. Most of people that were literate copied all the books, and as they copied them, they learned them. But what they did was copy. You don't need to know spelling to copy. You just copy letter by letter, right? And if you make a mistake, you draw on it, right? You make a fantastic illustration, and and this is how a lot of illuminations really emerge. It's really mistakes. They're fantastic mistakes, but they're still mistakes. And as this became more and more common, we actually had to standardize spelling. So even spelling is a technology, because spelling is a technology. Again, it's that need to make everything clear to everybody. We had to standardize, and over time, we standardized spelling as well. So as schooling develops, we have to develop new technologies that would actually fit. This is what came next. In the 19th century, people started collecting things into book and write these magnificent manuscripts that we call encyclopedias. And the idea was, let's collect everything we know into one book. I mean, imagine what they're saying, really. Let's collect everything we know about anything into one book. It's going to have a lot of volumes, and by the time we're done, we need to start all the way at the beginning, right? Because we're not done, and every home must have one, and it does, right? And that held on for a long time. Because the truth is, when we did research, when I was young, and you did research in school, if you wanted to study all about whales, you went into that one, right? And you opened, if you were lucky enough and that volume wasn't missing, right? But if that volume wasn't missing, or in the case I grew up in Israel, and there was the Hebrew encyclopedia, and the problem was it was being published as I was growing up. So I couldn't explore anything beyond the 10th letter because it was just not out yet. So there was half the world was not available to us. We survived, but really that's what we all had, right? We had this. What did it mean to do research? It meant you went to the encyclopedia, you opened the right page, it was a page and a half, and you created a summary. If you were really, really, really lucky, there were 2 more books in the library that had something to do with what you were studying, and they were only 30 years out of date, give or take, right? So, in the 1970s, I had, and that's true, the Britannica. I mean, if you went to the early pages, they were written in the 1940s. And we keep discovering new things. If we could just keep knowledge static, it would be perfect. You would have a book with everything we know. It turns out it doesn't work quite that way. So, Britannica was a fantastic invention, and that, with the spelling book, brought to classrooms again. Classrooms we can recognize. I mean, we have better furniture in some schools, small, and we have maybe a little bit more space, but then they had a really good heater, and she actually had control over the temperature in her room. And we have a blackboard, right? Again, all technologies that were aimed at providing the right kind of access, the right kind of technology for the time. So we are actually able to recognize those schools from the 18th and 19th century. Does anybody know what this is? This is an early switchboard from the internet before it was the full internet, when it was ARPANET and it was connecting different universities and different agencies in case of nuclear attack. This is how the internet started. And it took a long time, when you really think about it. It took about 40 years for that to become something we all are aware of and understand. But it really is one of those technological innovations that really changes, in some ways, everything. Because now we have something that changes the way we think and the way we access information. And this brings us back to that cave in Qumran. Because this is very, very different. 2,000 years ago, they wrote those manuscripts. They are invaluable, right? They were preserved almost by a miracle. This was not expected. I do not think they thought it would last 2,000 years. I do not think they could fathom what would be 2,000 years. And more than that, some of them actually thought the world was coming to an end rather soon. Which to this sect, they seem out in the desert, that's actually true. We know they have perished and not survived the war against the Romans. But their documents have. For 2,000 years, we didn't have access to these documents. Another 50 years, only very, very few people could actually lay their eyes on them and explore them. And in a way, the world community was very upset, the research community was very upset with this thing. How come a few people get access, get to see this wonderful treasure trove? They cannot process this much. And this is what has changed. And Google is an example of this. Google has actually made it their business to put any book they can get their hands on. They have problems with the copyright, but outside of that. And any other sources of information, and this is their heritage project, which has lots of other examples, but I think that this is a good example, because now, after 2,000 years of being hidden in the desert, and 50 years of being in the hands of a few researchers only, suddenly anybody, whether professional or not, can look at them and can magnify them as much as anybody else could, and study them, and think about them, share them, have insights about them in a way that was never possible before. So when we think about what has changed, this has changed. This has changed the way we think, the way we do, the way we have access to information. And that idea of access is crucial. This is just a short demonstration of how many people, and this is how many people out of 100 in the developed world and in the developing world are actually have access to the internet, have access to all of those resources. There's a huge gap in there. But at the same time, the whole world is moving in that direction. The whole world is getting access, if you would like, to these scrolls, whereas for 2,000 years nobody did. And what we have out there is the new challenge. If the challenge used to be, let's find something, let's do something, let's find out some information, the finding isn't a problem anymore. We've got to sort. We get a lot. We've got to sort, we've got to evaluate, because when you go to study the same whales that I did, right? And I don't know if you can see this, but when I search for whales on Google, I get 24 million pages. You know, sometimes I think to myself, if we had such a happy thing, we went to the Britannica, and what Britannica didn't know about whales, nobody knew. And my teacher didn't know either, right? My teacher was perfectly fine with a summary of what was in the Britannica because she didn't know anything about whales either. There are no whales in Israel and the Mediterranean, if there were any ever, they all got killed a long time ago. So we couldn't even see them. Definitely not see a movie of them jumping up and down unless we watched something on TV and we had no way even to record that, let alone use that in any way. And all of this is now accessible at the push of a button, so the task became something completely different. The task became a task of sorting and evaluating data and thinking about your information. And I'm talking about this in the positive, and I really want to talk about this in the positive, but it's not all positive, right? Because when we had Britannica, we had somebody that was in charge of sorting. And that could be rather annoying if you got not included in what was in the Britannica, but there wasn't as much false information out there either. There wasn't as much the ability to use things that were put by people who had no right to put them, or as about a year ago, there was an interesting story about a researcher that did some original analysis of documents and find out that what we've been saying in some history books, and I won't go into the specific case right now, but what we say in the history books is wrong, right? I have the original documents and there's proof that this is wrong. So he went to Wikipedia, after he published his paper, he went to Wikipedia and he tried to change that entry. And every time he tried to change that entry, 10 people would come in and change it back because they read in the history book that it was the other way. And so it becomes fantastic when we rely on this crowdsourcing, when we rely on people, whether they're amateurs or professionals, to participate, and we want people to participate. There's so much more knowledge because everybody's contributing, but there are moments where that can be counterproductive. I'll give another example, and this is an example out of Israel. Right now in Israel, there's a return to polio. We have found polio in the sewer system, which means people have polio, at least as carriers. We are very, very worried. And so Israel is a state, because it is a developed country, and went into a mode, let's immunize kids. We haven't for a while because it was eradicated, we have to do it again. 20 years ago, we went through the same thing, there was no problem. Everybody got immunized, nobody complained. Nobody got sick, nobody got hurt. Not from the polio and not from the vaccine. In 2013, the story is different. In 2013, some people say, I don't want to. There's information out there saying this is dangerous, this is more dangerous than polio. I don't know how a vaccine can be more dangerous than polio. But since nobody remembers polio really, people don't think they're afraid of it. So they're endangering their own kids, they're endangering other people's kids. Those 1 or 2% that cannot be immunized for a variety of reasons. But that information is also out there. So there is danger, and that's why we as educators have to help kids. And there's a great session today, but have to help kids to sort and evaluate information, because the task is not defining, the task is making judgment about what's appropriate and what's not. And as teachers, we have to help them very early on to do that. I think that is at the heart of this. There are other messages that we can have going forward, but this is where we really need to be. And this is where I want to go back to the iPads. I think the iPads is another jump. It's not the iPad itself, but it is the devices that are like it. Because this is different than using a computer because it moves with you. It is different than using a computer because it doesn't necessarily require typing or even using a mouse. And because it allows you to do a few different things, and I think that's where it's at. This is where it is different than your laptop or your desktop or anything else. Because it's mobile, you can take it anywhere. You can go to the museum, you want to use it because you'll get a lot more information and you can save your memories with you. You can take it to the zoo, you can take it on a field trip, you can take it to heritage school, although I think that's not allowed. But maybe it should be. Because it provides another layer of information that you would never be able to get. Anywhere you go. This summer we had a few teachers from one of the reservations up north. I will not identify this because I haven't asked their permission. And they're creating an outside classroom. And what they've created during the summer is for their outside classroom, they've taken pictures of the plants there, and they're going to have plaques, and the plaques are going to have some information, but now what they've added is they've added a QR code, and if you walk around with a mobile device and you use that QR code and you are connected to the internet, you can find out a lot more about that plant, but more than that, you can find a recording of the name of that plant in the native language, and the stories that are connected to it, so suddenly this interaction with something small can become so much more. And it's not about keeping people in the classroom necessarily, it's actually about being able to take them out. Because now the technology goes with us everywhere. Now the technology can help us record and study and add information in a way we could never do before. The second aspect is the social aspect, and that is interacting with other students around the world. One of the things that really have taken on is blogging for students. And blogging for students is a great way to incorporate writing and to encourage writing, because now they have real audiences and not just fake audiences, namely teachers and parents. I'm not sure you knew you were fake, but you are a fake audience. Because kids know we have to respond, we have to read, and we will have to say nice things about them. But that's not true of other kids or even other adults, right? They don't have to like it. They can tell, they've never seen you, they've never met you, they can say all kinds of things about you, and if they like it, it means something very, very different. So the social aspect is key, and what has been taking place, and I think is going to happen more and more, is that idea of flipped classrooms. And I don't mean it, and I don't want to be interpreted necessarily in the way that Khan Academy, for example, was used, although I'm not necessarily fully opposed to it. But I think that our ability to work with our students, using devices, using the access they all have and we have, to support their learning at home, to support the learning outside of school and in school, by giving them control over some of the instructional time, and by switching the relationship between what happens in class and what happens at home, is really meaningful. So really what we have is a new device, a new technology, and that new device and new technology, just like the clay tablets, just like the printed book, have the potential to change how education happens. It doesn't have to. We can dig our heels in and refuse to change. And I'm not talking about us as teachers, I'm talking about us as a society. And say, no, school has to be what school's always been, is time immemorial, and actually we know school has changed tremendously even over the last few hundred years. But we can dig our heels in and say, no, we have to do exactly the same school, and even if we will allow you to change, we'll still measure it. And this is a key point. We will still measure it in their own way. We'll give them paper and pencil tests or computer tests that look like paper and pencil tests. All right? Just so clear where I stand on these things. But if we want to move forward, we have to change the way we think about this. And this is going to take a while, and this is going to take the help and the efforts of everybody involved, but we have to, because if not, we're not preparing kids to deal with the world. We're not preparing them for how you interact on Facebook, we're not preparing them for how to look for a job, because, you know, and I keep giving this example maybe because I'm still hoping that my son will find a job. But every time he walks into a place and says, do you have a job? They say, Yes, we do, and if you go home and get online, you will be able to apply, because nobody wants your piece of paper, right? And if you want to find out what's the next issue on the ballot during the elections, or what do different candidates say, or how to take a class, chances are everybody's going to tell you the same thing. Go online, there's a wealth of information. You've got movies, we've got pictures, we've got text. A lot better than we can really do that in person. So if we want to prepare kids, this is where we have to do this, and we have to prepare them to the world that we can't really predict. But we can't do that by teaching them as if it was still the mid-20th century. So hopefully we will get there.